ஒரு பக்கம் பார்க் பண்ணிக்கிறேன். It's on live stream now. நம்ம ஸ்டார்ட் பண்ணலாமா? Can we start?
நீங்க எப்ப சொல்றீங்களோ அப்ப ஸ்டார்ட் பண்ணலாம். நீங்க இன்ட்ரோ듀ce பண்ணிடுங்க. நீங்க பேசிடுங்க, அதுக்கு அப்புறம் நான் பேசுறேன், அப்புறம் தாக்ஷாயணி ஆரம்பிச்சுக்கோங்க.
Good evening to every one of you. On behalf of Indian Academy of Pediatrics Chennai City branch, we are very happy to come out with a recent research assistant for practitioners and postgraduates, a unique program from IAPCCB, deviating from the conventional way of conducting only case reports or mere talks. It is a very different approach. We thought it will be very helpful for postgraduates especially, as well as practitioners. We have to thank Dr. Sridevi Narayanan for taking this task. And this is the 4th series. And we have Dr. Dakshayani, Professor of Pediatrics from Government Tiruvannamalai Medical College. We all know Dakshayani, her passion for teaching, her knowledge in pediatrics as well as the research. And we have our Nedunjalian sir, who is the teacher of teachers and guru in research, epidemiology and research, all the kind of research studies. Thank you, sir. Thank you for guiding us in this program. Now I asked Dr. Sridevi to introduce the speaker.
A very good evening, one and all. Am I audible?
You are audible.
Okay. So this innovative program from IAPCCB brought out by our President Sudhakarji is on research assistance for postgraduates and practitioners. So basically, instead of conducting regular case presentations, he has come up with this novel idea. So many people are interested in doing research, but they want to know how to go about it. Research is a vast subject, and to get inducted into it, it is not as interesting as clinical medicine to most of us. So this is an effort from us to present it as capsules in a very concise form. And we have broken the whole research into the basics of how to do a research into 10 topics, and we are presenting one topic every month. So first month we started with how to choose a research topic. Then we presented to you on how to do a literature review, which is the first and foremost step for starting to do a study. Then Dr. Priyadarshini spoke to you last month about the framework of research, including hypothesis, how to frame the objectives, and all those things. So next in line comes once you frame the objectives, you need to choose an appropriate study design for your research. So today that study designs will be dealt by Professor Dakshayani, who is Professor of Pediatrics from Tiruvannamalai Medical College. So she will be taking you through the fundamentals of study designs. This is anyway, we would like to give a statement that everything about the study designs cannot be covered. It is just going to be a primer of study designs, which she is going to cover today. Anyway, you have to do further reading to make a overall picture. So over to Dr. Dakshayani to give an overview of the study designs.
Thank you, Big Boss. And at the outset, I thank IAPCCB, Sudhakar sir, Lakshmi, and for the opportunity. And my heartfelt thanks to my teacher and teacher of teachers, Nedu sir, for mentoring me into this, and my teacher, my close friend and associate, Dr. Sridevi Narayan, for literally hand holding me. With that, I'll start this talk on study designs. Big Boss, can you move the slides?
Yeah.
This this talk will cover an introduction to study designs, the type of study designs, concentrating on the descriptive studies, analytical studies, experimental studies, and eventually a summary of it. The introduction. A research study design is a framework or the set of methods and procedures used to collect data and analyze data on variables specified in a particular research problem. Coming to the types of study designs, overall, the epidemiological studies are classified into observational studies and interventional studies based on whether you intervene or the investigator chooses to observe. The observational studies are in turn classified into descriptive studies, which can be a case report, which is a detailed description of one single case. It could be a rare disease or a rare manifestation of a common disease. And then comes the case series, which is a detailed description of a disease entity in more than one case. A population study or an ecological study is conducted on population groups. The unit here is the population group, and individual level data will not be available from population studies. These study designs will not be suited for dissertation topics for PGs. Then comes the cross sectional descriptive study. We'll talk about this later. The other group is the analytical study. This analyzes data of two groups. You have two different groups. They're compared, and the data are analyzed at the end. So this could be a case control study, a cohort study, or an analytical cross-sectional study. Coming to interventional studies, they are again classified into randomized control trials and non-randomized trials based on whether randomization has been done or not. Next slide. So, did the investigator assign the exposure? Will be the foremost question in a study design. If the answer is yes, it is an experimental study because the investigator has assigned an exposure and he has intervened. Was there random allocation? If it's yes, then it's a randomized control trial. If the answer is no, it's a non randomized control trial. If the investigator has not assigned any exposure and it is the natural flow that is being observed, it's an observational study. And if this study, observational study, does not have a comparison group, it is a descriptive study. It describes the group. If there is a comparison group, then it becomes an analytical study. And how does this analytical study proceed? In what direction? If it proceeds from exposure to outcome, it's a cohort study. If it proceeds retrograde from exposure, from the outcome to the exposure, then it becomes a case control study. If the exposure and outcome are studied at the same point of time, then it is a cross sectional study. Next slide. So, coming to the hierarchy of epidemiological study designs, from simple generation of a hypothesis to the strongest, robust design, wherein a causality can be established, the hierarchy goes thus: from case reports to case series, ecological studies, cross sectional studies, case control studies, cohort studies, and the most robust being randomized control trials, which will help in establishing the causality. Next slide. Next slide, Bob. Coming to descriptive studies, as the name implies, this is an observational study which describes the occurrence of a disease in a population. This defines the disease distribution in a human population and identifies associated characteristics of the disease to formulate a etiological hypothesis. Next slide. So the cross-sectional studies, a descriptive cross-sectional study, is the simplest of the studies, of the descriptive studies. In this study, a cross section of the population is selected and information is obtained from this population at one single point or a period of time. Large studies, large cross sectional surveys may take place even over years, but each subject will contribute to the data only once. This data is collected either via questionnaires, examinations, or investigations. These studies are used to formulate hypotheses. Next slide. So the advantages of the cross-sectional surveys are that they are easy and quick to perform, less expensive, and based on these run surveys, you can plan healthcare services delivery. The limitations are that this is the weakest observational design. This measures only the prevalence, not the incidence, and because it is conducted at one point of time, you are unsure of the timeline of disease occurrence. You are not sure whether the exposure happened first or the outcome happened first. Next slide. Analytical studies. As the name implies, these studies are carried out to analyze relationship between the exposure and disease. These kind of studies, they are helpful in making measurement of the pattern of exposure and the disease in population. Analytical studies, they use a comparison group and the objective is to test the hypothesis. So this is a design of an analytical cross-sectional study. So as already mentioned, a cross-section of a population is taken and details regarding the exposure and the outcome are collected at a single point or a period of time. So a defined population, you collect data on exposure and disease. Naturally, you have four endpoints: exposed and people who have the disease, exposed but do not have the disease, not exposed and have the disease, and not exposed and do not have the disease. So at one end of the spectrum, you have exposed and deceased, and the other end, you have non-exposed and non-deceased. So this prevalence of disease is of disease interest, and prevalence of exposure is at the other end. It is of exposure interest. The strength of association can be measured by cross product or odds ratio. Next, coming to the case control studies, they are suited for rare diseases. Cases and controls, as the name implies, they are defined by the presence or absence of the outcome respectively. Retrospectively, you determine the exposure. This does not directly provide incidence data, and the measurement of outcome is odds ratio. So this case control study is suitable for rare diseases. Here you have a total population, and of that you have a reference population, and in that you have cases and controls who have the disease and who do not have the disease. You are defining and recruiting both, and retrospectively you are determining the previous exposure among subjects. So cases who have the disease would have been exposed or would have not been exposed. Controls who do not have the disease would have been exposed and would have not been exposed. The outcome measure again is odds ratio. Next slide. So the advantages are that because this is a retrospective study, it is easy to carry out, relatively easier, rapid and inexpensive, and requires only few subjects. This is suited for rare outcomes, and there is no risk to subjects, no attrition issues, and ethical problems are minimal. But the biggest disadvantage is that because it is retrospective, it carries a high weightage of bias. You have to rely only upon memory or past records. Selection of appropriate controls is also difficult, and temporal relationship is usually assumed, but it is not always proven. You never know whether the exposure definitely happened prior to the outcome. Cohort study. This is relatively a robust study. A cohort is a group of people who share some common characteristics. Example, a birth cohort, marriage cohort. This group of people should be at risk of developing the disease of interest, but should not have the disease under study at the time of selection. They should be disease free. The elements of a cohort study includes selection of the study population, collecting baseline data, selection of an appropriate comparison group. When possible, you will have to have an appropriate age and sex matched comparison group, and follow period for a longitudinal period, and analysis of data. So a design of a cohort study, you have exposed and non-exposed, and they are followed up, and disease develops or not does not develop in the exposed, disease develops or does not develop in the not exposed. So the measurement of outcome is relative risk, which is the incidence of disease in the exposed upon the incidence of disease in the unexposed. So this is the So overall, the type of cohort study. So in a prospective cohort study, you design a study, and only after that exposure happens, and it is for the group is followed up over a longitudinal period, and you wait to see whether disease happens or not. This happens in the prospective direction. So this is a prospective cohort study. The ambispective cohort study happens when exposure happens prior. In 2000, an exposure happens. The study starts in 2026, and you wait for the disease progression until 2040. So that is an ambispective cohort, because in the timeline you stand at 2026, the exposure happened in 2000, and you wait for the disease process to happen until 2040. That is an ambispective study. A retrospective cohort study, you start the study in 2026. For example, I would take the example of COVID pneumonia in children. All children with who develop COVID pneumonia in 2020 would be recruited, and they would have been followed up until 2025 to see whether pulmonary fibrosis develops. But my timeline here, I plan to conduct a study now in 2026, but the exposure happened in 2020, and the outcome was assessed in 2025. Both the exposure and the outcome has been over in the past. It is a retrospectively collected cohort, but the direction is always prospective. At this point of time, beyond 2026, I would want to follow the same cohort until 2030. So this timeline should progress beyond 2026, even if I plan to conduct a study in 2026. So the exposure happened in 2020, children were followed up until 2025. I plan to do a study in 2026, and if this happens to be a retrospective cohort, I will have to follow up these children until 2030. So the direction is always prospective. By retrospective cohort, we mean to say that the cohort has been retrospectively assembled in the past. Next slide. So the advantages are, it is used in the study of rare exposure and multiple outcome. Temporal sequence will always be clear, and this reduces the risk of bias. This is not suited for rare diseases, and because this involves a long follow period, the migration and attrition of subjects prior to the outcome ascertainment may lead to bias. Next slide. So, is prolonged screen time associated with a high risk of obesity? The investigator compares the group of obese children cases with non-obese children controls. He collects details about screen time and the exposure uh, with both the groups. You have a case, you have control, and retrospectively you collect details about screen time exposure. So two groups are selected based on the presence or absence of an outcome. This is a case control study. The investigator measures the screen time at baseline and examines the children at follow-up visits prospectively to measure the BMI to see whether they are obese or non-obese. This is in a prospective direction. Two groups are selected based on the basis of exposure. They are followed over time. This is a cohort study. When the investigator decides to interview both obese and non-obese children in a group and gets detail about their screen time exposure, whether it is prolonged or adequate, appropriate, and correlates them with BMI values, this collection of data is only over a point of time. So this is a cross-sectional study. Next slide. So for the same research question, you can do a cross-sectional case control or a cohort study. So in a prospective study, you have a in a prospective study, you have exposure, you don't have the outcome. In a retrospective study, you have an outcome, you don't have an exposure. You collect the exposure data. In a cross-section study, you have all. Next slide. So when the study proceeds from exposure to outcome, it's a cohort study. When it proceeds from outcome to exposure in a retrograde direction, it's a case control study. When both the exposure and outcome are studied at a given point of time or a period of time, it's a cross-sectional study. Next slide. Interventional studies. Two or more groups under the direct control of the investigator are being compared. So the investigator observes and compares the outcome of experiment in both the groups, and this study would give scientific proof of etiological factors which permit the modification and control of those diseases. It measures effectiveness and efficacy of health services for the prevention, control, and treatment. This is the most robust study design. Next one. Next slide. So the objectives are to evaluate new form of therapy. It could be a new drug or treatment, medical healthcare technology, delivery system of healthcare, new method of primary prevention, or new program of screening or early detection. Next slide. Next. Next. So for evaluating a new therapy or intervention program, the basic steps in conducting an RCT include drawing up a protocol. You select the reference population and the experimental population. Based on the consent or the eligibility, then you randomize. There is an intervention. One group receives the intervention, the other group does not receive the intervention. They are followed up over time and finally assessed for the outcome. So, population suffering from the disease, you pick up a sample from the population, you randomize, give treatment 1 or a new treatment, treatment 2 or standard old treatment. This could be a new treatment or old standard treatment, or a new treatment or a placebo. After a periodic follow, you will have a treatment one group will continue with the disease or will be cured of the disease. Treatment two group will continue with the disease or be cured of the disease. So this disease proceeds from the present point and progresses to the future. Next slide. So randomization, this ensures that the participants have an equal chance to be assigned in either of the groups. And this happens only by chance and not by priority or affinity. So thereby the selection bias is negated. One group gets the most widely accepted treatment and the other gets a new treatment. And this randomization provides the best way to prove the effectiveness of a new agent or intervention, because it ensures that all groups are as similar as possible and the selection bias is minimized because we have already randomized the groups. Blinding, again, it reduces the performance and measurement bias. The participant and the observer, they are not aware of which group the candidate or the participant belongs to. That is a double blinded study, which will be ideal. In single blinded, the participant will not be aware, the observer will be aware. In triple blinded study, the participant, the observer, and analyzer will not be aware of which group the candidate is ascertained to. Open label study does not involve randomization. Next slide. So control trials can be concurrent parallel study design. First, after randomization, two groups, one group gets treatment A, one group gets treatment B. After a periodic follow period, they are ascertained for the outcome. In crossover type of study design, after randomization, one group gets treatment A, one group gets treatment B. After wash off period, the groups are crossed over, and the group which gets treatment A will be now getting treatment B and vice versa. So this design is peculiar in that each participant will serve as his or her own control. Both the groups will be finally ascertained for the outcome. Non-randomized trials, because randomization is always not possible in groups, like in smoking and lung cancer, like a radiation exposure, and you look for anomalies. So such things cannot be under our control. So those are non-randomized trials. RCT in human beings are not always possible due to ethical reasons. Some interventions can be done only in groups. So yeah, there is no possibility of randomization or blinding. For example, if you want to test fluoridation of water, you can do only a community trial. The other examples are uncontrolled trials, before and after comparison studies with or without control and using historical controls. The advantages are that this is the only effective method which is known to control selection bias. This facilitates effective blinding. Disadvantages are that it is, despite being robust, it is very complex and very expensive. It lacks representativeness because sometimes the participants you choose will be different from the population of interest. Ethical challenges are, of course, immense. So finally, we have a research question, and we want to decide on the appropriate study design for the question. So if you want to study on the prevalence of vitamin A deficiency, you will do a cross-sectional survey. If you want to do a clinical course of Zika virus infection, you will do a cohort study. If you want to test the efficacy of ranitidine against omeprazole and APD, you will do a double-blinded randomized control trial. If you want to study on the usefulness of procalcitonin in the diagnosis of neonatal sepsis, you will do a descriptive study. Spectrum of clinical features of a rare genetic disorder, you can go ahead doing a short case series. So that brings to the end of the session on study designs. I think I've kept it simple as
Yes, the best
such.
way you're doing.
Thank you,
Coming
Dakshayani,
from,
for that
yeah.
clear and succinct presentation on study designs. So now over to our mentor, Nedanjalian sir, for his concluding remarks.
Good evening to you all. As
Thank you.
Dr. Dakshayani told, the study design can be considered as a skeleton of any this one research over which we need to actually erect the entire structure. So when we call case control study, you you should not actually jump and say that it is case control just because they have authors, they have used cases and control, but it should be the analysis also should be for case control analysis, that is arriving at odds ratio with 95% confidence interval, all these things. Then when we consider a retrospective cohort, the cohort is retrospectively assembled and there should be a prospective actually component in that particular study design to be specified as a retrospective cohort. So in the descriptive study, we have two approaches. As Dashayani told, we have all the four will be available: exposed with the disease, exposed without disease, unexposed with disease, and non-exposed without disease. So a snapshot view will be able to see in a cross-sectional view. So our interest, it may be the outcome may be a disease which is interested. So we need to start from the exposed, unexposed, this one exposure factor. If our actually interest of outcome is exposure factor, we need to start with those who have the disease and those who do not have the disease. That is about the descriptive study, how the approach is there, even though all the four are there. So when somebody asks which is the best study design or robust study design, always the answer will be randomized control trial. It is not so. It is not the universally best study design. It depends on the hypothesis mainly. For example, randomized control trial need not be there for an incidence or prevalence actually study. Simple cross-sectional survey will be enough. So don't go and say that the robust study design is the randomized control trial. It depends on the hypothesis what we have put forth. For example, maybe when we want to study the natural course of the disease, it cannot be considered as an experiment. We can actually follow it as a simple cohort study with the exposure first to start with, from the initial stage of the disease to the outcome, namely cure or not cured, death or maybe recovered with sequelae, etc. The outcome. So there maybe cohort is as well very enough. So that is the thing. And the thing, as she has actually put in, when we start in the case control study, we know outcome and we will be looking for the exposure factor. When we actually come to the cohort, we know who are exposed, how many are exposed, and how many are not exposed, and what is that exposure factor, and we will be following the population exposed and unexposed for the outcome, namely disease and not disease in each group. If the disease is among the exposed group, we will be actually having a relative risk more than one, and the association is proved. Whereas in the descriptive study or cross-sectional study, we will have all the four at the same time. Our approach should depend on the whether our outcome interest is based on the disease we are interested in knowing, or whether we are interested in knowing the outcome. That way, this so whatever the abstract, if it is given, you should be able to identify what it is. And when we have one hypothesis in our hand, actually we will be able to decide what study design we should actually select. So it is actually not only mainly on the hypothesis, other factors which determine it. The major factor among them is ethical consideration, as she has actually rightly brought out in the study of proving tobacco versus lung cancer. You cannot make somebody to smoke knowing that the smoking can cause lung cancer. So it is ethically not feasible. The next study design will be cohort. So the population, there are people who are actually destined to be smokers. You continue them as a follow them as exposed to the smoking and look for the outcome of cancer. And those who are non-smokers, who have decided not to smoke throughout their life, maybe you follow them for decades to actually for the outcome, namely how many develop lung cancer or not. The problem of large sample to be actually recruited, we need to wait for a long time, financial commitment is more, manpower needed is this, all these things, all these disadvantages are there for cohort also, as compared to randomized controlling. The only thing is there is no actually ethical issue, which is the big issue in the experiment when we want to do. So it depends on the ethical consideration, then manpower, money power, and as well as the constraint of time. Based on all these things, maybe the study design, but whichever is the best one, we need to select. I think I have covered certain areas which we should actually concentrate, not simply thinking that the study designs are easier one. It is actually by itself, it can go for a 1 week workshop. We have nicely, Dachani has put it in the nutshell. So the thing is, at the first step, you look at whether the investigation is under our control and it is actually deliberately done. If the answer is yes, it is experiment. And if the answer is no, it becomes observational study. These observational studies are further classified into analytical and described based on whether there is a comparison of some 2 or 3 groups are there and some analytical procedures are there. If it is the answer is yes for any one of them, it becomes analytical study, and the other one becomes descriptive study. The analytical studies are further classified into case control or prospective. The prospective, that is cohort study, based on the exposure to outcome, or it is outcome we are looking for the exposure, that is a retrospective study. Based on that, it becomes this one. The classical example for experiment human in the human or clinical trials, that is maybe a non-randomized or randomized control trial. The classical example for descriptive studies are your regular descriptive studies, case series, case reports, or cross-sectional survey. That is the way we can actually classify. There are one or two other way of classifying, will be confusing. This is the 3-step based approach, which if you remember, you will be able to label any actually abstract or maybe study is being given to which study design it belongs. Otherwise, you will be actually getting confused very easily between actually case control. Just because actually they are labeled as cases and control the study groups, you cannot actually jump and say that it is a this one case control study. As I told you, you should have to be considered as case control study. The analysis also should follow for a case control analysis, namely arriving outcome arrived at as a odds ratio with 95% confidence interval, and in the cohort, of course, it is relative risk with 95% confidence interval. I hope with this we can end. Nice, Darshani, you have put it in a nutshell. This is what we can actually do, and we cannot actually justify more than this.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you. Thank
Naranjarian
you,
sir.
sir.
Thank you so
And
much.
thank you, Dakshayani, for the wonderful talk.
Thank you.
So now that we have seen as sir pointed out, the hypothesis or the objective determines what study design we are going to adopt. So that is why we spoke on, we had this talk today. So the next bottleneck after choosing your study design is your sample size determination. So that will be the topic for the next month session, and that will be dealt by Dr. Hemchand. So let us all wait for one more month for the yet another interesting session. Thank you. Over to Sudhakarji.
Thank you. Thank you. On behalf of everyone present here and IAPCCB and our EB team, I extend my sincere gratitude to Dr. Dakshayani, Professor of Pediatrics, Thiruvannamalai Medical College, for delivering such an informative talk. Very difficult to understand actually, basically. But your talk was very insightful on research study design. Very essential for every postgraduates actually. And you are made in a very simple, very crisp presentation. And your practical examples really give a valuable insights. And this will definitely help the students in research endeavors. And I thank Dr. Sridevi Narayanan for continuously doing this with a passion, and Dr. Nedunjalin sir for sparing his valuable time at these hours and regularly following us and guiding us. Thank you, every one of you for attending this. Thank you, Dakshani again.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Good night.
Thank you, sir. Good night, sir. Big boss, thank you.
Thank you all. Nice. It was fine.
Thank you, sir.